On Hans Follick's Girl with Tarpan. The painter Hans Follick, whose work is largely unremarkable, but who has risen to prominence in the Western art world for his unnerving 1912 composition Girl with Tarpan, is remembered this month with a special exhibition in Munich, the artist's hometown. On the occasion of its near centennial, I have taken the opportunity to revisit this improbable masterwork, which I first saw on tour many years ago in a cramped secondary gallery of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and have followed with great interest ever since. The painting was composed quite purposefully in the Impressionist mode, a style from which, throughout his career, Follick never deviated. Briefly summarized, it depicts an early 20th century European zoological garden, presumably in spring. In the foreground, we are given a partial view of a large animal enclosure in which a single petite quadruped resembling a tarpan, the Asiatic horse whose 1909 extinction was challenged by the zookeepers of Munich, though long after Hans Follick's time, stands in quiet obedience. At the heart of the painting, trapped on the opposite side of the enclosure, stands a girl in a lemon-yellow pinafore, gazing intently and almost entirely at the tarpan, though also very slightly at the viewer. She cannot be more than 11 or 12 years old, and she regards the tarpan with such esteem and longing that we are led to believe she wants nothing more in all the world than to lay a small, unassuming hand upon its sloping mane. Other details of the scenery are cursory at best: a pathway, a building or two in the background, some kind of sky. It is the congress between girl and tarpan alone which generates the painting's curious, unlikely power. From a technical standpoint, the painting's efficacy is difficult to explain. Follick's slavish devotion to the impression as late as 1912 is initially suspect, on top of which the painting's adherence to its chosen style is incomplete. Rather than capturing the light and image of a passing moment, Follick's girl and tarpan sink forever into the canvas in an eternity of girls and tarpans. Meanwhile, the extraneous background details of the painting detach themselves and float away, leaving the two figures on a nearly empty plain. In addition to these shortcomings, there is the rest of Follick's oeuvre to consider. How could the author of such petty canvases as Königstrasse Window Box and Early Afternoon in the Blue Doorway have executed the astonishing Girl with Tarpan? Failing any explanation of natural talent, aesthetic sensitivity, or artistic development, the secret of the painting's success in the wake of so many failures may perhaps be found in the artist's biography. Hans Follick was born in 1880 near St. Jakobsplatz in Munich, a German Jew with an inexplicably Gaelic surname. Little is known of his origins except that his father was a cloth merchant and also, perhaps, a tailor. Of his mother, Follick mentions in passing in an ardent letter to German poet Stefan George that never reached its intended recipient, her shockingly red hair. No additional details survive. Follick did not appear before the gods of history in earnest until 1900, his 20th year, when he began to show his work in the cafes and minor salons of Munich. By that time, it seems that he had broken entirely with his natural family, whether for personal or professional reasons, fear of anti-Semitic censure, or simple indifference, we do not know. Hans Follick became an Impressionist painter at a time when Impressionism was out of fashion everywhere. Even Americans were, by that time, beginning to look at hard angles with something other than derision. The Gallic discipline arrived late in Germany, if it can be said to have arrived at all, eclipsed as it was by post-Impressionism and later the expressionist works of Der Blaue Reiter. Somehow, Follick managed to exist entirely outside these advances. The elegant simplicity of Max Liebermann was perhaps his sole contemporary influence. Through his early 20s, he continued to paint in blissful ignorance of modernity. Meanwhile, both the conservative and the elderly grew fond of his work, steeped as it was in orthodoxy and sentimental calm. By 1904, Follick had earned enough money to quit his day job at one of the cafes which grudgingly hung his paintings, and to wed. In 1905, he married Goethe Grün, the Gentile daughter of a Municher house painting contractor and retailer. Despite the claims of more fanciful historians, it is impossible to determine if this same man later hired onto his crew a young Viennese transplant with artistic pretensions named Adolf Hitler. From his father-in-law, Hans Follick obtained for his work not the paint itself, but the supplies with which he mixed his own oils. Following the birth of their only child, a dour and troubled boy christened Niels after neither his Jewish nor his Lutheran forebearers, Hans and Goethe grew apart. He retreating into painting, she to the succor of a child with the unsettling habit of smothering sparrows and other small birds in turpentine-soaked pillowcases. In the wake of his son's increasing violence, Falk began to concentrate greater and more protracted intensity on landscapes and fauna. His human figures, already dim and out of focus, now disappeared entirely. In 1912, Niels Falk strangled and butchered a large albino peacock that had managed, who knows how, to escape from a wealthy neighbor's aviary. The results of the boy's efforts were arranged carefully on his parents' bed, awaiting eventual discovery by his horrified mother and permanently staining the Bavarian lace duvet, a wedding present from Herr Grun. It was perhaps this act of barbarism on the part of his son, the last he would ever witness, which inspired the series of events resulting in Hans Falk's only masterpiece. That night, Niels was spirited away by agents in the employ of Goethe's father, who told his daughter and his son-in-law that the child had been sent to a country hospital that specialized in such situations. The next day, the grieving mother took to her bed and Falk to the streets of Munich. In the evening, he returned to his studio only and through the tradesman's entrance. He never again set foot in the house. 2 weeks later, Girl with Tarpan sat finished on an easel by the door, but Hans Falk was gone. Following the turmoil of 2 world wars, the painting was unearthed as a symbol of German cultural endurance, and for years made a tour of Europe and the Americas. Finally, judged too old-fashioned for the Pinakothek der Moderne, the painting was installed in the Neue Pinakothek, where it may now be viewed alongside a smattering of the artist's minor works, generously donated by prominent local citizens. Critics with more speculative minds than mine have suggested that the girl of the painting's title was sacrificed to both Falk's domestic despair and his artistic ambitions, that this great work came at the price of a human soul. More difficult to dismiss than this absurdity is the appearance of the tarpan, impossible between its 1909 extinction and attempts at its regeneration in the fascist 1930s. One can easily imagine that Falk saw such a beast prior to 1909, perhaps on a youthful outing, which he recreated in 1912 from memory and extant zoological sketches. What one cannot imagine is that the scene between Girl and Tarpan is anything other than a moment from real life. Of the 14 days spent in the studio, the actual process behind Girl with Tarpan, and the eventual whereabouts of its composer, we know nothing. However, we do know that 2 weeks prior to Hans Falk's disappearance and the painting's discovery, a 12-year-old girl was reported missing from Tierpark Hellebrunn, the Munich Zoo.